I still remember the look the Alaska State Trooper gave me. Not because he thought I was lying, because he looked like he'd heard this story before. When I finished telling him everything that had happened, he didn't ask me where my brother went. He asked me one question. When was the first time you heard someone call your name? At the time, I thought it was a strange question. Now, I think it was the only question that mattered. This happened a little over 6 years ago. My younger brother, Ethan, had just turned 24, and he was the kind of person who never sat still. If there was a weekend off, he already had a plan before Friday even started. Hiking, fishing, camping, driving 6 hours just because someone online said there was an abandoned mine or an old fire lookout worth seeing. He loved stuff like that. Me? Not so much. I liked being outside, but I also liked knowing there was a gas station within 20 minutes. Ethan used to joke that if civilization disappeared overnight, I'd somehow still find a Starbucks. He wasn't completely wrong. The trip wasn't supposed to be anything special. It actually started because of a conversation over burgers. Ethan slid his phone across the table. You've ever heard of the Alaska Triangle? I looked at the screen. There was a map with 3 points connected by lines. Anchorage, Juneau, Utqiagvik. I shrugged. No, he grinned. Thousands of people have disappeared there. I rolled my eyes. According to who? The internet. There it is, he laughed. I'm serious. So is the internet every time it tells me Bigfoot stole someone's canoe? He just shook his head. You always ruin everything. I keep you alive. Same thing. For the next 20 minutes, he kept bringing it up. Missing hikers, planes that were never found, hunters disappearing without leaving tracks, old stories from native communities, even pilots who refused to fly certain routes if weather conditions changed too quickly. Most of it sounded like exactly what you'd expect, half history, half folklore, half people making things up. Yeah, I know that's 3 halves. Ethan pointed that out too. A week later, he called me. I found a cabin. What kind of cabin? An old trapper's cabin. No. You don't even know where it is. I don't need to. It's abandoned. Even worse. We'll only stay 1 night. No. I already requested the days off. You already requested mine too, didn't you? There was about 3 seconds of silence. Then he laughed. I knew you'd say yes eventually. I literally said no. You'll be packed by Thursday. He wasn't wrong. Somehow, he usually wasn't. The drive out there was beautiful. The kind of beautiful that's hard to explain if you've never been to Alaska. There are stretches where you can drive for what feels like forever without seeing another person. No towns, no houses, no traffic, just mountains, trees, rivers, and enough empty space to make you feel very, very small. At first it was peaceful, then after a while, it became strangely quiet. Not silent, just empty. Like the world had more room than people. We stopped twice for gas. The second station was barely more than 2 pumps in a tiny store. Inside, an older man behind the counter asked where we were headed. Ethan told him. The man nodded once, didn't smile, didn't say we were going to have fun. He just looked at Ethan for a second longer than felt normal. Then he asked, "You boys staying overnight?" Ethan said yes. The man reached into a cooler, grabbed 2 bottles of water, set them on the counter, and said, "Take these." Ethan laughed. "We're already stocked." "I know." "They're free?" The man nodded. "Take them anyway." There wasn't anything dramatic about the exchange, nothing creepy. If anything, it was just odd. We thanked him, grabbed the water, and left. When we got back in the truck, I asked, "You know him?" "No." "What do you think that was about?" Ethan shrugged. "Probably just nice." Maybe. That's what I told myself too. The dirt road to the cabin wasn't really a road anymore. It was more like 2 faded tire tracks cutting through the trees. Branches scraped against the sides of the truck. The GPS had already lost signal nearly half an hour earlier. Eventually, Ethan slowed to a stop. "We're here." I looked around. There wasn't much to see, just trees, a narrow trail, and a small wooden sign so weathered I could barely make out the words. The last letter had almost completely faded away. I remember stepping out of the truck and taking a deep breath. The air was cold, clean. It smelled like pine and wet earth. For a second, I actually understood why Ethan loved places like this. Then he threw my backpack at me. "Come on." I caught it. "One day I'm going to leave you in the woods." He smiled. "If you can catch me." He started walking down the trail. I followed. At the time, I had no idea that would be the last completely normal conversation we'd ever have. The walk to the cabin only took about 20 minutes, but it felt longer because Ethan couldn't go 5 minutes without stopping to look at something. A strange mushroom, fresh moose tracks, an old tree that had probably been standing there longer than both of us combined. That was just who he was. He noticed details most people walked right past. I'd tease him about it, but if I'm being honest, those little detours are some of the things I remember most now. The cabin itself wasn't nearly as dramatic as I'd imagined. It sat alone in a small clearing, tucked between the trees, as if the forest had slowly grown around it over the years. The roof sagged a little, one of the windows had been boarded up, and the porch leaned just enough that I instinctively tested every step before putting my full weight on it. It looked abandoned, not haunted, just forgotten. Inside, there wasn't much to see. A small wood stove, a rough wooden table, 2 bunks, a few rusted cans left on a shelf. The place had probably been empty for years. The only thing that didn't seem to belong was a notebook sitting in the middle of the table. It wasn't old enough to have been there for decades, and it wasn't covered in dust like everything else. Someone had picked it up within the last few years, you could tell. At first, it wasn't interesting at all. Most of it was blank. A few pages had grocery lists. Someone had sketched parts of the surrounding trails. There were a couple of notes about fishing spots that probably meant something to whoever wrote them. Then, almost at the very end, there was a single sentence written across an otherwise empty page. "If you hear someone calling your name after dark, make sure you know who's standing in front of you first." That was it. No explanation, no signature, nothing before it or after it. I remember staring at it for a few seconds before handing the notebook back to Ethan. Neither of us really knew what to make of it. We eventually settled on the most logical explanation, that somebody with a weird sense of humor had left it there, and after a while we stopped talking about it altogether. At least we thought we had. The rest of the afternoon was completely normal. We unpacked our gear, gathered firewood, made dinner, and wasted more time than we probably should have sitting outside with coffee in our hands, watching the sun slowly disappear behind the trees. If you'd taken a picture of us that evening, you would have seen 2 brothers on an ordinary camping trip. Nothing about it would have looked unusual. Looking back now, I think that's one of the reasons everything that happened afterward still bothers me. There wasn't a moment where it suddenly felt like we had stepped into a horror story. It stayed ordinary, right up until it wasn't. As evening settled in, the woods became noticeably quieter, not silent, just missing something. Earlier that day, we'd heard birds almost constantly. Now, there was nothing. No birds, no insects, no wind moving through the trees. At first, I didn't think much of it because I'd never spent much time that deep in the Alaskan wilderness. I figured maybe that was just how the forest sounded at night. Ethan noticed it too. He didn't say much, but every now and then I'd catch him stopping what he was doing for a second, almost like he was listening for something. Neither of us wanted to be the first person to admit that the silence felt different, so neither of us did. After dinner, we decided to take one last walk down to the creek before turning in. It couldn't have been more than a 5-minute walk from the cabin. The moon was bright enough that we barely needed our headlamps, and for a few minutes, we just stood there watching the water move around the rocks. It was probably the most peaceful moment of the entire trip. On the way back, Ethan slowed down. He hadn't heard anything. He hadn't seen anything. He just had that feeling people get when they suddenly realize they're paying attention to something they can't explain. I asked him what was wrong. He looked back toward the trees for another second before shrugging it off. Probably nothing. That answer satisfied me at the time. It doesn't anymore. When we reached the cabin, I noticed Ethan looking down instead of toward the door. There was a fresh set of boot prints in the dirt near the porch. Just one set. They came from the direction of the trees, stopped a few feet short of the steps, then turned around and disappeared back into the forest. No prints led onto the porch. No prints led into the cabin. Whoever made them had walked all the way to the front of the cabin, paused, and left. I remember kneeling down because my first thought was that we'd somehow made them earlier, but the tread didn't match either of our boots. We stood there for a while trying to come up with a reasonable explanation. Another hiker, a hunter, someone checking on the old cabin. Every explanation sounded possible. None of them explained why they stopped without ever walking up to the door. Eventually, we went inside, not because we'd solved the mystery, because neither of us wanted to keep standing outside thinking about it. That night, before turning off our lantern, Ethan admitted something that surprised me. He said he couldn't stop thinking about the sentence in the notebook. I laughed and told him it was just someone's idea of a joke. He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. Neither was I just wasn't ready to admit it yet. I don't know what time I finally fell asleep. I only know exactly how I woke up. Someone quietly said my name. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a scream. It sounded almost conversational, like someone standing just outside the cabin was trying not to wake anyone else. I opened my eyes immediately. Before I could even sit up, I heard Ethan's voice from the bunk above me. It was barely more than a whisper. "Please tell me you heard that too." For a while, neither of us said anything. I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe I'd been dreaming. Maybe Ethan had been dreaming too. We'd spent the entire evening talking about that notebook, and it wouldn't have been the first time someone's imagination got the better of them after a long day in the woods. Eventually, we convinced ourselves it wasn't worth worrying about. I don't remember exactly when I fell back asleep. The next thing I remember is waking because cold air was hitting my face. At first I thought the fire had gone out, but when I opened my eyes, I realized the cabin door was standing open. Ethan's bunk was empty. I wasn't immediately scared. If you've ever camped before, you know people get up during the night all the time. My first thought was that he'd stepped outside for a minute and forgotten to shut the door behind him. I grabbed my jacket and walked out after him. The clearing looked exactly the way it had before we'd gone to sleep. Moonlight covered everything, and for a second it was so peaceful that I actually felt a little embarrassed for worrying. Then I noticed his flashlight. It was lying on the ground several yards away with the beam still shining into the trees. I picked it up and called his name. When nothing answered, I called again. I remember waiting after the second time because I was almost certain I'd hear him yell back that he was fine. Instead, all I heard was the creak somewhere off in the distance. That's when I started looking more carefully. The ground was soft enough to hold footprints, and it didn't take long to find Ethan's. They led away from the cabin at an ordinary walking pace. Nothing about them suggested he'd been running or chasing something. I followed them farther into the trees than I probably should have. Then they ended. I don't mean they became difficult to see. I mean they ended. I spent longer than I'd like to admit walking in circles, convinced I had simply lost the trail. I kept expecting to find the next footprint a few feet ahead, but it never happened. Looking back, I think that's the moment I stopped believing this was something simple. The next few hours are honestly a blur. I searched until the first light started coming through the trees. Every few minutes I'd stop and listen, hoping I'd hear Ethan moving somewhere nearby or calling my name. Nothing ever came. Once it was bright enough to drive safely, I made it back to the truck and kept going until I found enough signal to call for help. The search started later that day. Over the next several weeks, I watched people who knew those woods far better than I ever would comb through miles of wilderness looking for my brother. They worked harder than I thought was possible, and I held on to the hope that someone would eventually find him sitting beside a river with a broken ankle or lost somewhere off the trail. That call never came. As the days turned into weeks, hope slowly gave way to questions nobody could answer. One of the state troopers interviewed me more than once. He was patient, never tried to rush me, and every time I remembered another detail, he'd write it down without interrupting. I told him about the notebook. I told him about the footprints. Eventually, I mentioned hearing someone quietly say my name outside the cabin. He didn't react the way I expected. He didn't laugh. He didn't look skeptical. He simply asked me when I'd first heard it. The question caught me off guard because it assumed I'd heard it. Not whether I had, just when. At the time, I didn't think much about it. Years later, it's probably the part of that conversation I think about the most. About a year after Ethan disappeared, I went back. People have asked me why, and I don't really have a good answer. Maybe I thought seeing the place again would help everything make sense. Maybe I just couldn't accept that my last memory of my brother was walking into those trees. The trail was still there. The creek was exactly where I remembered it. Even the clearing looked familiar, but the cabin was gone. Not collapsed, not burned. It simply wasn't there anymore. All that remained was the old stone foundation and a rusted stove sitting in tall grass. For a long time, I convinced myself I'd somehow found the wrong clearing. Then I noticed the same weathered wooden sign near the trail, the one with the last letter almost completely worn away. It was the right place. I've spent years trying to come up with an explanation that makes sense. Maybe someone moved the cabin. Maybe I misunderstood what I saw that night. Maybe grief has a way of changing memories without us realizing it. I'd honestly prefer to believe any of those, because the alternative is admitting that, for one night, two brothers walked into the same stretch of wilderness, and only one of them ever walked back out. People assume the scariest places are the ones with a reputation. In my experience, it's usually the places nobody talks about. I was 26 and finishing my master's degree in marine biology when my advisor offered me what sounded like the easiest research assignment I'd ever had. A stretch of abandoned coastline near Portlock, Alaska, had been left almost completely untouched for decades. The goal was simple: document how the marine ecosystem had changed after so many years without commercial fishing or permanent human activity. For someone hoping to build a career studying remote coastal environments, it was the kind of opportunity you didn't turn down. Getting there wasn't easy. Portlock isn't somewhere you accidentally drive through. You either arrive by boat or you don't arrive at all. Even before I left Homer, the isolation of the place became obvious. The captain who agreed to take me out there asked more questions than anyone I'd met during the entire project. He wanted to know how many nights I planned to stay, whether anyone knew where I was, whether I had a satellite phone. At the time, I thought he was just making conversation. Looking back, I don't think that's what he was doing. The ride across the water took a few hours. The weather shifted every 20 minutes, moving from calm to rain and back again, as if it couldn't decide what season it wanted to be. When the shoreline finally came into view, the first thing I noticed wasn't the abandoned buildings. It was how quiet everything looked. Not peaceful, just empty. The old cannery sat near the waterline, weathered gray by decades of salt and wind. Beyond it, thick forest climbed the hills until the trees disappeared into low clouds. It was beautiful in the kind of way that reminds you how small you really are. As I unloaded my equipment, the captain stayed by the boat longer than I expected. He watched me carry my cases onto the beach without saying much. Just before he untied from shore, he finally spoke. "I'll be back in 3 days. He paused for a second, looking past me toward the tree line instead of at me. "If you decide you want to leave sooner, don't wait until morning." Before I could ask what he meant, he'd already started the engine. I stood there listening to the sound of the boat grow quieter until it disappeared around the point. Then there was nothing left except the wind, and the feeling that Portlock had been waiting for someone to come back. The first day went almost exactly the way I'd planned. Most of my work involved documenting the shoreline, collecting water samples, photographing tidal pools, and recording the different species that had returned since the town had been abandoned. It was quiet work, and after a few hours, I started to understand why researchers loved places like this. With no roads, no tourists, and no cell service, the only sounds were waves breaking against the rocks and seabirds circling overhead. By late afternoon, I'd almost forgotten about the captain's warning. The old buildings were in worse condition than I had expected. Roofs had collapsed, windows were long gone, and thick moss had claimed almost every surface that wasn't constantly exposed to the salt air. Nature wasn't just reclaiming Portlock, it had nearly erased it. I spent an hour photographing what remained of the cannery before following a narrow trail toward the tree line. According to the old maps I'd downloaded before the trip, several small homes had once stood farther inland. Most of them had disappeared. Some had collapsed into piles of weathered timber. Others were hidden beneath so much brush that I almost walked past them without realizing they had ever been there. One cabin was different. It was still standing, barely. The front door hung open, swaying every few seconds whenever the wind found its way through the trees. Inside, almost everything had rotted away. A rusted stove leaned against one wall. Shelves had collapsed onto the floor decades earlier. Whatever furniture had once been there had become little more than splintered wood. The only thing that looked out of place was a small enamel coffee mug sitting on a windowsill. It wasn't clean, it wasn't new, but it looked like someone had placed it there deliberately. For a moment, I caught myself wondering how something so fragile had survived while everything around it had fallen apart. I took a photograph and kept moving. On my way back toward camp, I noticed something else. The forest had gone quiet. Not gradually, all at once. The gulls were still out over the water, but inland, there was nothing. No branches moving, no birds, no insects. I remember stopping because the silence felt wrong. I told myself I was overthinking it. Remote places have a way of making you notice ordinary things you'd ignore anywhere else. That evening, I cooked a freeze-dried meal beside my tent and reviewed the day's photographs on my camera. Most were exactly what I had expected: rock formations, sea stars, kelp beds, the abandoned cannery. Then I reached the picture of the cabin. At first, I couldn't figure out what was bothering me. I zoomed in. The coffee mug was exactly where I'd seen it, but behind it, in the broken window, there was something dark enough to block the light coming through from outside. Not a face, not a person, just a shape. I stared at the screen for several minutes before convincing myself it was probably a shadow from one of the broken beams inside the cabin. I closed the camera, finished my dinner, and tried not to think about it again. Looking back, I should have trusted the feeling I had when the forest went silent, because that was the last evening Portlock ever felt empty. I didn't sleep much that night. It wasn't because I heard screams or footsteps. It was because every time I started to drift off, something would wake me. Sometimes it was the wind pushing against the tent. Sometimes it was the sound of small rocks shifting along the shoreline as the tide came in. Each time I'd unzip the tent, shine my flashlight across the beach, and find nothing. By sunrise, I felt ridiculous. I even laughed at myself while making coffee. The photograph, the silence in the forest, the captain's warning, I had let all of it get into my head. After breakfast, I packed my camera and decided to spend the morning surveying a section of coastline just beyond the old cannery. The tide had gone out overnight, exposing rocks and tide pools that hadn't been visible the day before. It was exactly the kind of opportunity I'd come there for. I spent hours working, long enough that I stopped thinking about the abandoned town altogether. When I finally turned around to head back, I realized something that made my stomach drop. The beach looked different. At first I thought I'd simply walked farther than I intended. Then I saw my own footprints leading back toward camp. There was another set beside them. They hadn't been there when I walked out. They followed my tracks for nearly 100 yards before leaving the sand and disappearing into the trees. I crouched beside them. They weren't clear enough to identify. The tide had softened their edges. They were simply larger than mine, much larger. I remember standing there longer than I should have, trying to convince myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe another researcher, maybe a hunter, maybe I'd overlooked them earlier. Every explanation sounded weaker than the last. I packed my equipment faster than I ever had before and started back toward the shoreline. By the time I reached my campsite, the boat was already there. The captain didn't wave. He didn't ask how the research had gone. He looked at my face for a second, then glanced toward the hills behind the abandoned buildings. "You ready?" I nodded. Neither of us said another word while loading my gear. It wasn't until Portlock had disappeared behind us that he finally broke the silence. "You stayed 2 nights." I told him I had. He looked out across the water and quietly said, "Most people don't." I waited for him to explain what he meant. He never did. I submitted my research to the university a few weeks later. The report was accepted without any problems. It still sits in the department archive today. Everything in it is true. The water samples, the photographs, the abandoned cannery, the species I documented. There's only one thing I never included: the final photograph on my camera, the one I took just before leaving. It shows the beach exactly as I remembered it, my footprints leading toward the water, another set following just behind them. And at the very edge of the frame, standing where the tree line begins, there's something tall enough that, even now, I can't convince myself it was a person. I deleted that photograph years ago. Sometimes I wish I hadn't. Most of the time, I'm glad no one else has ever seen it. The first time I heard my wife's voice, I smiled. The second time, zonk. I nearly walked into the river. I know how that sounds. If someone had told me this story a year ago, I would have blamed exhaustion, isolation, or one too many nights alone in the Alaskan wilderness. That's exactly what I told myself, until I heard her say something only she could have known. It happened during a 6-week wildlife survey along the southeastern coast of Alaska. Our team was documenting sea otter populations, nesting birds, and changes in the tidal marshes before winter storms rolled through. It wasn't glamorous work. Most days were spent hiking the shoreline with cameras, GPS equipment, and notebooks that always seemed to end the day damp. There were 4 of us when the survey began. By the end of the second week, I was working alone. Not because anything had happened. Our survey area had simply expanded, and splitting up covered more ground before the weather turned. The nearest village was hours away by boat. Cell service disappeared the first afternoon. By the third day, the only sounds I expected were waves, gulls, and the occasional splash of an otter. That's why the silence caught my attention first. The birds didn't explode into the sky. Nothing dramatic happened. I just realized I hadn't heard anything for several seconds. Even the wind seemed to pause. Then it returned all at once. I stood there for another minute before laughing at myself. Being alone does strange things to your head. That's what every field researcher says. I checked another waypoint, logged a few photographs of the shoreline, and kept moving. About an hour later, I reached a narrow river that emptied into the bay. It wasn't on the main trail, just a shallow channel weaving through moss-covered stones before disappearing beneath thick spruce trees. There was nothing remarkable about it. Still, I caught myself staring at it longer than I should have. Not because I thought I saw something, because I had the overwhelming feeling that someone was standing just beyond the tree line, watching me. I scanned the shoreline. Nothing. No footprints, no movement, no broken branches. Eventually, I shook it off and started unpacking my camera. That's when I heard it. "Daniel?" My entire body froze. The voice was soft, barely louder than the river itself. It came from somewhere beyond the trees. I turned so quickly, I nearly dropped my camera. Nothing. Just the river, the spruce, the sound of water slipping over smooth stones. I smiled to myself. I even remember whispering, "You're losing it." My wife was in Seattle. She'd never been to Alaska. And yet, for just a second, I would have sworn I'd heard her call my name. I didn't tell anyone about the voice. There wasn't anyone to tell. Every evening, our team checked in over satellite radio. We'd report weather conditions, wildlife counts, and where we'd be surveying the next day. When it was my turn, I almost mentioned it. Instead, I heard myself say, "Nothing unusual to report." The lie came surprisingly easy. That night, I barely slept. Not because I heard anything, because I kept waiting to. The following morning, I convinced myself exactly what had happened. Isolation, long hours, too much silence. The human brain is good at finding familiar patterns where none exist. I'd read enough psychology papers to know that. People hear their phones vibrate when they haven't. Parents swear they hear their babies crying after weeks without proper sleep. The mind fills in blanks. Mine had simply chosen my wife's voice. Problem solved. Or so I thought. Around noon, I found fresh sea otter tracks weaving through the mud near the mouth of the river. Exactly what I was hoping for. I spent the next hour photographing prints, measuring distances, and recording GPS coordinates. Work has a way of pushing strange thoughts aside. By the time I packed my equipment, I'd almost forgotten yesterday entirely. Almost. As I stood, I noticed something odd. The tracks I'd been following simply stopped. Not faded, not washed away. Stopped. The final print ended in damp mud, less than 10 feet from the river. Beyond it, nothing. No return tracks. No drag marks, no signs that the animal had entered the water. I stared at the ground longer than I'd like to admit. Eventually, I shook my head. There had to be an explanation. There always was. The walk back to camp took nearly 2 hours. The trail wound between towering spruce, patches of moss, and narrow streams that fed into the bay. Halfway back, I heard someone laughing. A woman, not loudly, just enough to carry through the trees. I smiled before I could stop myself. Emily had a habit of laughing at her own jokes. It was impossible to mistake. The sound came again, short, warm, comfortable. For one stupid second, I actually took a step toward it. Then I froze. Emily hated the outdoors. She refused to camp for a single night. The closest she'd ever come to Alaska was helping me pack my bags before the flight. My smile disappeared. The laughter stopped. The forest became impossibly still. I waited. Nothing. No footsteps, no branches moving, no birds. Only the river somewhere ahead. I don't know how long I stood there, maybe 30 seconds, maybe 5 minutes. Eventually, I forced myself back onto the trail. I didn't look toward the trees again, not once. That evening, while heating dinner over my stove, the satellite phone rang. It was Emily. She called whenever the weather allowed. The first thing she said was, "You sounded distracted yesterday." I laughed. "I've just been tired." There was a pause, then she asked, "Did you hear me yesterday?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," she said quietly. "This is going to sound weird. Yesterday afternoon, I was sitting at work and I had this overwhelming feeling that you were calling my name." Neither of us spoke. Finally, I smiled. Coincidences happen, that's all they are. Coincidences. I changed the subject. We talked about home, about work, about what she'd cooked the night before. Normal things. By the time we hung up, I had almost convinced myself everything was fine. Then just before crawling into my sleeping bag, I heard it again, soft, patient, from somewhere beyond the river. This time, it wasn't my wife's voice, it was my mother's, and she'd been dead for 8 years. I didn't answer my mother's voice. I don't know if it was instinct, or fear, or because some part of me knew that dead people don't wait beside rivers. I stayed inside my tent until sunrise. Sleep never came. Every few minutes, I'd hear something outside, a branch snapping, water moving, soft footsteps through wet grass, always just far enough away that I couldn't be certain. Every time I reached for the zipper, the sound stopped. The next morning, I packed my equipment. I told myself I'd finish the survey early. No data was worth another night out there. As I loaded my backpack, I noticed something resting beside my camp. An otter. At least, that's what I thought. It stood on a fallen log watching me. It didn't run. It didn't seem afraid. It simply tilted its head before slipping silently into the river. I watched the water for several seconds. Nothing came back up. The boat wasn't scheduled until late afternoon. That left nearly 5 hours to reach the pickup point. The trail followed the river almost the entire way. I hated every step. More than once I considered cutting through the forest instead, but the terrain inland was nearly impossible. The river was my only practical route. Around midday, I heard her again. Emily. Not shouting, not screaming, just talking, as if she were walking a few yards ahead of me. "Daniel?" A pause. "You forgot your jacket again." She laughed softly, exactly the way she always did when she thought I was being absent-minded. I stopped walking. The voice continued, "I've been looking everywhere for you." It sounded happy, normal, alive. Every instinct I had told me to keep moving. Instead, I answered, "Emily?" The forest fell silent. Instantly, every bird, every insect, even the river seemed quieter. I felt something shift behind me. Not a sound, a presence, like someone had stepped close enough to cast a shadow over my back. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Every nerve in my body screamed not to. Then, very close to my ear, I heard my wife's voice whisper, "You answered." I ran, not because I saw something, because I finally understood. Whatever was following me didn't need me to believe it. It only needed me to answer. Branches tore at my jacket as I stumbled down the trail. Behind me I heard voices. Not one, several. My mother, Emily, my father, a friend I'd buried in college, all calling my name. None of them shouted. They didn't have to. They sounded exactly like people trying to help someone who's gotten lost. I kept running. I never looked back. The boat captain was already waiting when I reached the dock. One look at me and he stood up. "You hear it?" I couldn't answer. He nodded anyway, as though silence was answer enough. Neither of us spoke again until the mainland was barely visible behind us. Then he reached into a small wooden box beside the wheel. Inside was an old piece of polished copper, worn smooth by years of handling. He noticed me looking. "My grandfather never traveled these rivers without it." He closed the lid. "I don't either." That was all he said. When I got home, Emily met me at the airport. She hugged me before I even reached baggage claim. For the first time in weeks, I felt safe. Then she smiled and said, "You know, I've had the strangest dream every night since you left." I laughed nervously. "What kind of dream?" She looked confused. "As if I was standing beside a river. I kept calling your name." My stomach tightened. "What happened?" She frowned. "I don't know. You never answered." I've never returned to that part of Alaska. The university reassigned the survey the following year. The report says I ended the expedition early because of deteriorating weather. That explanation satisfied everyone. Sometimes, late at night, my phone will ring from an unknown number. There's never anyone there, only the sound of slow-moving water. And just before the call disconnects, a quiet voice asks, "Daniel?" I never answer, not anymore.